Hi, today is Monday, November 18th, 2013. It's 1:08 a.m. I'd like to discuss with you some very dangerous ideas. Dangerous in the way that they're likely to radically change how you think about and use your mind, particularly your intelligence, which, quite frankly, although everybody's pretty certain we know all about this, let me assure you that we're wrong. In fact, the real undiscovered country is human relation. And if you look around the world today, you can see this so obviously. In every single corner of the world, we have incredible technological ability, and it's destroying everything we love and need to learn and become and be. Meanwhile, we get glorious representations and electronic museums. In fact, I'm afraid we are becoming glorious representations and electronic museums. And the problem with that is that memory and intelligence are alive. They are nothing like machines, regardless of what modern people think. If you go directly and touch nature, you will find something there so shocking and deep that you will realize suddenly why 100 million books were written instead of one about it, and why those 100 million books are not even foam on the surface of what they're talking about. Most people think they know something about what nature is because science tells us what it is. Religion kind of has a different story, not a very interesting one, by the way. But science tells us a lot. Unfortunately, what science tells us is bereft of most of what nature is. This is easy to prove. They missed 90% of the cells in your body. They just overlooked 90% of them. Yeah, your bacterial cells. They didn't count them in your DNA. They attacked them when you were sick instead of realizing they might heal you. They also recently announced that they weren't sure what 99% of the matter in the universe was. Whoops. Sorry, we don't know what 99% of that out there is. Yet this is our most trusted authority for not only for knowledge, which there's a little bit of, there's a little bit of reason to trust science about many aspects of knowledge, not all of them. But we trusted and still trust science about identity, what something is. And that's a grave mistake. For what something is never objectively discernible. For human beings especially, we bring the what. And the way that we bring the what and the methods, the perspectives, the goals, these are all crucially important. So I want to talk a little bit about some rather shocking ideas that don't belong in any specific branch of human knowledge. They're very general. And one of them has to do with the meaning of space. What is space? What is the between of things? What is that stuff that separates everything? What is the barrier between you and I that somehow we can never cross? Why do we want to explore the space beyond Earth? How much do we really know about the space around us? What is the nature of space itself? How does it truly relate with time, which we understand from Einstein and relativity to be essentially inseparable? But do we think that way? And if we do, how deeply have we thought that way? Have we even caught up with what we learned in the early part of the 1900s? I don't think we have. In fact, our language kind of prohibits us from doing so. So I'd like to talk a little bit about space and its peculiarities, the things that we don't notice that will profoundly affect our intelligence if we do notice them, because they have to do with how we became intelligent, why and how we might remain intelligent or not, and our relationship to ideas, language, knowledge, science, religion, nature, each other, everything. And that's why it doesn't really fit in any topic. It's such a general topic. It's space. I mean, come on, everything that you see is an instance of it in some uniquely bounded fashion. Isn't that an astonishing thing? It's as if, I mean, language is really a form of spatial use. It involves time. If there's no time, you can't have language because it all collapses. Poop, it's just a speck now. Bloop. If you have no space, the letters on a page just become a black speck. Bloop, again. If you have no time, you get a speck. If you have no space, you get a speck. Isn't that interesting? So that openness, that space, there's an intelligence there, and I don't mean something scientific or mathematical. I mean a potential that is moving and alive and vital and mysterious and unknowable. In fact, it is unknowable, and yet to throw it away entirely is a grave mistake. For this intelligence, its fingerprint is written in every object, every living being, every eye, the music of my voice, the wonder in our hearts, and the power of our minds. It's written in the tragedy and striving of all of human history. It's written in every leaf, in the child's laughter. It's written in the passion that drives our most secret urges and compulsions and dreams. It's everywhere. This fingerprint. And we don't need to say, actually, whether this is the fingerprint of that legendary supernal being, the Holy One, who is all beings and all things. We don't have to say whether this is a religious discussion, or a scientific discussion, or a folk discussion, or a philosophical discussion. We can just have a discussion. Yeah, we don't have to decide, because the fingerprint is everywhere, no matter how we decide to classify it. It's in every form. It's in your own fingerprints. This is actually why I chose that metaphor. So space is a kind of intelligence, and it's what we throw away. You know, the alchemists, who were men and women, seekers, concerned with transforming human knowledge and understanding. They were concerned with an impossible degree and kind of non-human insight. And many of them realized early on, and they tried to encode this in ways that wouldn't make it too obvious, for they didn't want everyone to know. They wanted only people intelligent enough to use this intelligently, to know about this, for they believed that if you simply heard this, it would be enough to help you take advantage of it, and that could be dangerous for people who are greedy or sociopathic. But what they would say is that the most valuable thing is what we throw away, what everyone discards. And of course, people think things like garbage and sewage and things we don't want. I'm not sure what exactly they refer to, and they may, if they were wise, they would be referring to something that changed according to context. But I can imagine something they might have referred to, and it satisfies both requirements. That everyone throw it away, and that it changes dramatically in its meaning and power according to context. And that is space. Think about the space that separates the letters on a page. And think about how that space has a single, unified shape. And that for each unique page, that shape is different. But it's a single shape. It's one thing. It's not each of the letters in their sequence. It's as if the letters remove something from a single shape and leave a single object with all of the information intact. As if you could throw away the letters, but we throw away the space. Isn't that interesting? And we can count the letters and read each one. as though it's the letters and the words and the sentences, the phrases, the ideas separately, gathered together in their separation on the page that are important. And yet, do you think we could read the space? And if we did, how different might our experience be? How much faster might we read? There are people who practice skills that allow them to read a page in an eye blink. It's true. And they've trained their minds to do this. And I think I know what they're doing. They're leveraging the fundamental intelligence of space. And they're also leveraging a different kind of intelligence in us, one that is formed of many myriads of tiny components and is more like a cloud than an individual, a cloud that can change shape into any form that's useful, or multiple forms that are useful, or multiple sets of multiple forms instantaneously. And we do have this kind of intelligence inside us, but it's very quiet, and it doesn't grandstand, and it usually won't show up for conscious inspection or evaluation. It doesn't like to be tested. It doesn't care to be challenged. It already knows its own skill, which is billions of years old. Evolution was its challenge. It passed. If you think you can compose when it can't pass, well, that's about the same as your shoe thinking it should be worn on top of your head. Because really the part of you that thinks that way is an appendage of this other part. And yet the part of you that thinks that way doesn't believe in the existence of the other part and is threatened by its silent master. This is part of the nature of human intelligence. Again, having to do with space. Because the real intelligence inside us, the intelligence that's so astonishing that it could solve any set of problems you could put before it in seconds. And you're carrying this kind of intelligence. Trust me. In fact, don't trust me. Go look and find it. Much better. And let's find it together right now, if possible. But anyway, you're carrying this anciently evolved intelligence that we don't have access to because we depend, as I said, sort of upon the shoe. And we expect the shoe to steer the ship. It doesn't work. As you know, as a person capable of walking or even moving, you have to steer where you go. You can't expect your prostheses to steer for you. Although in our time, we've become quite confused about this, and this affects our relationship with space, time, memory, and intelligence, all of which are intimately linked. In fact, I'm going to suggest that space, time, memory, and intelligence are one thing, and that we've been looking in some of the wrong places for our scientific advancements. I won't say for the unified theory, that would be a bit strident, but we could probably go a long way if we began to understand that part of science must include nature, which means it must include us and living beings. It must include relational time, other modes of time that we don't consider scientifically, and certainly don't consider linked to physics. And yet, impossible that they're not. They can't not be. Living beings are a mode of time-space. We keep pretending they're separate somehow, and they're watching time-space or something. No, sorry. In fact, the really strange thing is that living beings and time-space are inseparable, which means time-space has to be a living thing. You follow me? You can't produce separate living things on a page. You can't have a page of, there's no page that you type on it and then living things come out. But time-space is that kind of thing, and you don't have to type on it. If you have time-space, it just produces, eventually, living things. And we know this is a fact. We are these things. It doesn't require science or religion to prove this really absolutely. We are these living things. If you had a glass of water on your table, think about this. There's something really interesting about space. And water will show us what it is. Suppose you had a glass of water on your table, or you found one there. Any table will do, and any kind of glass of water, as long as it's relatively transparent. And you notice the water there, and you decide not to do anything about it, for reasons we don't need to explain here. And as time passes, you think you see there's something forming on the bottom of the water. Now, at first you think, I'm not sure what that is, but over time it looks to be maybe crystals. So you take some of them out and taste them. Turns out they're salt crystals. And, you realize that the water must have been salty, unless someone put salt in it. So it's one of the two. The water was salty to begin with, of its own accord, somehow it was salty at first, or someone put salt in it. The universe is kind of the same way. If you get living beings, then the water must be living beings-y, right? The water of time-space it's not going to produce living beings if it's not living beings-y, and even if it wasn't before, once it does, it is. Yeah, you see? And then if it wasn't, then who put them? Who put the salt in the water? Did someone put it there? This is kind of the idea of God, but we don't need to go anywhere like that to understand these things. We can stay right in terrain that's safe for everyone, and children, and anyone, with any kind of belief, and just look at what's going on and see much more clearly. There's something about space that leads to intelligence, isn't there? If you take it away from a page, if you take all the space away, all those letters collapse to a little black speck. And that can't have any intelligence, can you? Because there's no way to read the letters. Unless you could watch them collapse, in which case maybe you could if you read them really quick while they were collapsing before they turned into a speck. Or if they collapsed and then re-emerged, and you could read them in the in-between. Which could be a little bit like what's going on if you think about, for example, how we wake up and go to sleep, which is we're dealing with time and space and consciousness, so this is a way that we relate with space. And we are born and die, and we begin and end, and we say hello and goodbye. All of these are, they deal with time, but of course, as we've been taught and yet did not fully understand, time and space go together. You can't really separate them. We are made of both, and all of our experience involves both. The experiences we think of as spatial are temporal. The experiences we think of as temporal are spatial. The beings and circumstances we think of as separate from that can't be. So, what I'm trying to say is that space has a very peculiar quality of potential, and it's the potential for intelligence, in a sense, for relation. There are many other potentials in space, obviously, but the one that I'm focusing on here is one we don't really think about. We think of space as empty. I think of the space that's available in my room as available. It's open. There's nothing in there. I mean, I know there's atmosphere in there, and I'm occupying it. Those are important facts. But the space is fundamentally open. And the way in which it is opened grants me what I'm going to call degrees of liberty, which are dimensions of possibility. And not just one, but a few. And the way that intelligence tends to happen is by linking these together in synergistic modules, if you will, that it then links these in turn in a kind of linear accelerator fashion to get results from even very modest gains that would otherwise appear monumental or impossible for their profound forward progress and ability to sustain themselves and grow and develop and, in fact, invent new ways, new dimensions into which they may grow and develop and discover themselves. So it's a very astonishing game, all because there's some space here. And when scientists say they don't know what 99% of the universe is, or maybe I got that statistic wrong, but I'm close. When they say that, or we hear something like that maybe from the media, have they ever wondered about what I'm talking about, that space and time and intelligence are linked? And that strange stuff they call dark matter could be really a mode of intelligence, a mode of space-time that is in itself intelligent, which all the other modes of space-time bear the fingerprint of, which would mean we are, in fact, kind of the walking fingerprint of that, and our fingers and everything, our fingerprints and everything, our eyes, the beauty of our speech and dreams. And in fact, that's true whether that's true of dark matter or not, because the space all around us has produced us. as a living, walking example of its character. So what must its character be if it didn't just produce us, but all of the living beings of Earth? Oh my goodness gracious me. All of those creatures, all of the organisms, all of their relationships, of which we know nearly nothing. Nearly nothing. We know about living beings in terms of functions and appearances. We do not know their nature or their deep intelligence, which, believe me, if you get a taste of it, you're going to be a little bit upset at the people who are hiding it from you. And you're going to know that it was both science and religion and folk culture and esoteric culture and human culture in general, because the beauty and power in nature are so overwhelming that they threaten everything humans think, want to be, and everything we believe about our own superiority. In fact, the slightest glance in the direction of nature shows that we'll never make a machine. The sum of machines we will ever produce is not worth a single ant. That's how profound nature actually is. We have a very backwards idea about this, and we're pursuing it wildly, in truth, because we're approaching the point where we have to recognize these facts or perish. So we're kind of having a wild last fling where we insist upon our intelligence and superiority in the face of every kind of staggering evidence to the opposite, especially in our relationships with each other, nature, and even technology and knowledge, language itself. All of these are relationships with space and time, development and evolution. And of course, evolution is an expression of the character of living space-time over, a span, over an expanse. And there's an intelligence at play there which we've presumed is mechanical. I would like to suggest that it's of a form or class we don't yet possess a reasonable model or word for. There's some very interesting things, though, that happen in normal space, just the space around us. And when I return in just a moment, after a brief break, we will continue and examine some of the more common experiences of space and some features of that we might find very novel. Stay with me. Silence is a kind of space. And if I change the space between my words, everything really starts to change. And if I also match my music to that change, we can feel a palpable sense of the power of space. And of course, music is a way of experiencing this, but music depends fundamentally on silence in the same way that writing depends on space and time, both. You can see with music, you actually can't ignore time. Time is included in the instructions. And so music was an early hint that time and space might go together, for the spatialization of music is also temporalized on the page. But here's a space we don't really think much about. The space of separation. If I put my face up against the page, I'm not going to be able to read it. I've got to have some distance to read it. Similarly, if I want to understand my own consciousness, I'm not going to understand it so much by having it. I'm going to have to somehow move outside or above or below. I need to get a perspective that I can turn back and look at it. The same as, and since our consciousness is kind of what we know with, what we experience with, what we see with, that can be pretty difficult to get enough space from, that we can bend it back upon itself and look at itself. And yet, that is the birth of the mind. We did that when we were a child. before we had a mind as such. And our species did that a number of times throughout our evolutionary history. But most recently, in order to refine the development of the representational minds that you and I are now both empowered by and trapped within, our not so distant ancestors actually discovered consciousness itself. It's hard to even imagine what that could mean, but effectively, many of the feelings and intuitions that we take for granted in our modern lives and thought were completely unknown to people, say, 1800 years ago. And in fact, many fundamental features of life were so different that their minds could not have been much like ours, except perhaps in their potential, their embodiment. It's very unlikely, for reasons similar to this. So separation is a very interesting kind of thing. The more distance you get, the more a different kind of intelligence you get, right? If you look very close at something, you're looking at a quick speed, right? You're looking at a much faster speed. If we looked closely at the table and saw the molecules, they'd be moving, not still. If we look in a microscope, things are usually moving and living at a much faster rate of speed than at other orders of perception or size. So that size and speed turn out to be somehow kind of related in a strange way. In fact, they might be inseparable from time and space, at least in a way that, like living time, we've not yet tried to understand. Yet I think we must, because our own minds and much of what we are depend upon these features of time and of space that we have no language for, no concepts about, no common ones. And we're going to need them. In fact, we needed them a long time ago, and we've been kind of lazy about them. Consider for a moment a peculiar quality of space. If we are looking at a landscape from within it, everything seems very immediate. What we see is about what's happening to us right now. As we move away from that landscape, the nature of our relationship, our visual relationship with time, is actually changing, so that if we move far away and we are, as we are moving away, achieving an elevated perspective, in other words, we're moving away not just in one dimension, but in two, at least. Or if we were to look out on a vast vista from, say, a mountaintop, what we would see is nothing like this moment. We would see a picture that is more or less unchanging. In other words, we would see tiny changes day by day, but none of the extreme speed and flow of change that we would see if we descend into the landscape from the mountain. And this is a bit like all of intelligence and all of life and all of perhaps death. Death being the ultimate distance from life would be outside of time. Yeah? And so we would see all of life, if that were useful or possible from any position beyond life, which I'm not claiming that it is. But if it were, we would see all of life from a timeless position. And so it may well be that our access to death is indeed, both through the people that we know and the parts of ourselves and our bodies that have died, all of our ancestors, most of us is dead. I mean, you are the living representation of the inception of life on Earth. That's a fuse, at least 3.5 billion years old at least on Earth, if it doesn't go beyond there, in linear years, many, many more relational years. In fact, many factors of that number of relational years. But you're at least 3.5 billion years old, so 99.99999% of that is dead. You're a little green tip, like a bristlecone pine tree that has like 1% of it is living, but it's 3,000 years old. You're like that. You're a little living tip at the end of a long stream of death. And that relationship is the source and body, in some sense, not only of your intelligence, but of your potential. And not just for intelligence, but for anything, for transcendence, for moving beyond anything that the humans are normally learning about, speaking about, thinking about, doing. You were born to do that. You know you came here for that. That's why you entered this space and this relationship with space, form, time, and death. So I just want to suggest that there's something very peculiar about distance, and that as we move close to something, our relationship with time changes dramatically. Move far enough away, it becomes eternal. And so when we look out into space, we think of traveling into eternity. We do not realize that right here at hand, it's just as possible, possibly more possible, because the eternity inside you is the living body of that eternity that seems to be out there. We need to think about space in very different ways, which I really think is the best teacher. There's a beautiful and impossible kind of space that we also don't think much about. Our eyes. Our eyes are an astonishing mode of space, and our pupils, the center of our eyes, are particularly interesting. Notice how the space has three major portions. The body of the eye, the iris, which is an incredibly beautiful physical structure, and the black pupil. That pupil represents the space. The eye represents space-time. The iris represents Earth and living beings. That pupil represents the space that is intelligent, and I would like to suggest, rather shockingly, that that pupil represents death. And that death, that space, that constricting or dilating space that allows us to focus and to adjust to varying degrees of flow, of light, which is, in a sense, time. That space is intelligence. That space is the possibility of intelligence. Just as I believe death and space, time, and intelligence are all deeply, deeply linked. But we don't think this way. Yet death is the form of separation, the ultimate form that we must imagine is the sudden and probably unexpected experience of separation from all that is humanly familiar to us. And that may happen in phases, or it may happen suddenly, I don't know. But that's the ultimate kind of space, and perhaps it's a very unique kind of time, or at least separation. And if separation is intelligence, well, that must be the ultimate kind of intelligence, because it's separation from all bounding, all binding. Right? You're no longer dimensionally, whatever you might have been is no longer dimensionally bound as the human body is, and as human minds seem to be, but in fact are not. Most of our ideas are what keep the mind bound. The body's bound to some degree by laws. The mind is not. And the mind is truly the child and master of time, space, death, intelligence, unity, separation, meaning, emergence, departure, the dawn, the twilight, the sunset. Each modes of light, changing modes of light that change time and meaning and character. So space, I think, is pure undifferentiated intelligence, and at the edges it collects, and wherever you see form, you're seeing the character of that space, including in speech, including in writing, including in art, very obviously, dance, yeah. But more than anything in nature and living beings. There is one other kind of space that I want to briefly touch on, and I will probably revisit this topic, particularly in light of the recent interest in Santa Muerte, the Saint Death, now very popular in South America, who I think is likely to be misinterpreted in the West, probably dramatically, because we think of death as an evil, dark, and bad thing, when in fact Death may be the very heartbeat of intelligence itself. How confused we would turn out to have been if that were the truth. If all that we loved was departing not into destruction, but pure, undifferentiated intelligence from which we ourselves will emerge, from which each moment of our minds are drawn actively. Yeah. So that all those dead and unborn speak here now with my own mouth, act with my own body, write with my own hands, just as we feel the noble and the true to have done, just as we experience when finally someone can say something so beautiful and true and amazing that we are at last relieved of our shame at our lot in human birth and restored to the hope and chance of dignity, of wonder, of truth, of a kind of purity that is not perfection, but is nobility of purpose and insight. And all of these things have to do with the topics we've explored here today: space and time and death and intelligence, separation, unity, and all of the forms. There's a kind of living space we don't much examine, and we need to before I go. It is that of water. Look at the ocean, okay? That's a living version of outer space. What are we doing there? Well, we're poisoning it. We're ripping it apart. We're mapping it with explosives. That ocean, moment to moment, contributes to our own sentience, to the basis of our minds and intelligence. Whatever we do there is done in our bodies and minds, instantaneously, not in the future, not in a cause and effect relationship, but right now. That body of space is the body from which all living intelligence arose and is the great conservation body of hope for our world. We must never allow any violence or aggression against the bodies of water on earth, for these are the sources of life and intelligence. And in our time, these bodies of water are the targets of lethally myopic collective bodies with no intelligence who are bent on profit, on converting the future into little stacks of money and numbers in machines, on converting our lives and bodies, on converting the hope and dreams of our ancestors and all living beings on earth into a poisonous cesspool and a temporal curse of shame for all human beings. We cannot allow this. This is a fundamental blasphemy against the nature of time and space, intelligence and death. We must protect the waters, for they are actually the very metaphor of consciousness itself. Whatever is done in those, we will echo it. And we have not yet begun to learn what the oceans, lakes, rivers, and streams could teach us if we simply understood how to listen, before we obliterate them with poisons for the sake of a few drops more energy or military power or a little bit more knowledge. We better look very closely at our own minds, because something's wrong. We're making a serious set of mistakes, and we're ramifying them dramatically with each new generation instead of resolving them. We need to stop, reevaluate what's happening, develop some intelligence before we continue ripping the basis of its heartbeat and connectivity apart. I'd like to end on a promise. We believe that space travel is very difficult and that our people might never be able to, or that it will take us a long time or many sacrifices. Yet there's a space inside us which we don't believe in and have never examined. And there are other forms of space here near at hand. The incredible dimensionality of nature herself, which is a mode of dimension that is intelligent beyond our wildest understandings. We're busy looking in outer space for other intelligences, but we've failed to locate the myriad branches of incredibly advanced intelligence all around us, and we haven't developed much of our own. This could have a lot to do with having misunderstood space. The things we've discussed here today are the beginnings of an antidote to these problems, and they're simple. They're not dogmatic. You don't have to believe in me or a religion or a science or a tradition or anything to understand them. You can just examine them yourself, expand on them. Think of them as toys that you can radically expand, because I hope that you will. Our goal here together is to learn to change how we relate, especially in language and thought, with space, time, separation, and death, so that we can begin to understand that degrees of liberty are important, and there are many different kinds of them. The diversity in the biosphere is the fundamental source of liberty and intelligence for human beings on Earth. We must protect and understand it with every aspect of our humanity, our technology, and our intelligence. Let's develop some while we still have a chance. Together, we've definitely got a good one. Thanks for joining me. Bye-bye for now.